It's a look back at the history of Pink Floyd, from Syd Barrett's visionary beginnings to the band's iconic 70s run to their enduring legacy in the post Roger Waters era. All that coming up next with author Mike Evans on Booked on Rock. Welcome back to Booked on Rock. This is the podcast for those about to read and rock, and we have a first-time guest on the show. His name is Mike Evans. He is the author of Pink Floyd Behind the Music. Mike, welcome to the podcast. Great to meet you.
Thank you. And you, yeah.
You point out in the introduction to how Pink Floyd's a rarity among the bands who are part of the progressive rock genre. Unlike most of them, Pink Floyd has endured in the public consciousness. What do you think it is about this particular band that sets them apart from all the others that came up during that period?
I think unlike some of the progressive rock bands, they did develop with the times to a degree. I mean, obviously they didn't absorb every trend. That would be rather what we would call phony. But they developed and they absorbed various developments in both technically and in the broad scope of rock music, which some of the progressive bands got stuck in if you like, a progressive rut, and they were very much in our minds now as bands of the 70s or whatever. Whereas I think Floyd did spread out for a variety of reasons. They encompassed a lot more. I wouldn't say genres, but certainly techniques and aspects of rock music than some of their contemporaries.
Do you think the return of the band after Roger Waters is a factor in continuing with the legacy among new generations of fans? Because me personally, I was a teenager growing up during the period of Momentary Lapse of Reason, and then in college during Division Bell, and there was a resurgence of interest in Pink Floyd then. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, obviously, it shows in their varying sort of record sales and so on, but also uh, because they've been so enduring in one way or another. They're, if you like, an antidote to things that were more ephemeral. Trends that came and went. Whereas they're a bit of an antidote to that because they became a fixture, even though it is never ever changing fixture.
Let's talk about the three eras: the Syd Barrett era, the post Syd Barrett era, and the post Roger Waters era. The original Pink Floyd was a different band in the beginning, and they were led by Syd Barrett, and they had Nick Mason, Roger Waters, and Richard Wright. David Gilmour wasn't in the band yet. They were lumped in with the psychedelic scene early on. Was that an accurate label to put on the band?
Yes, because the psychedelic scene was they were part of the creation of that psychedelic scene. I mean, I was around in London uh, at the time playing in a band, and I remember they were on the horizon. They were fooling around with various what became psychedelic gimmicks, if you like, light shows and distortion in the guitar playing, and let's say fantastical kind of lyrics, which were mainly inspired at the time by Syd Barrett. I mean, interestingly, they originated in Regent Street Polytechnic, a college in central London. And I was a student there at the same time. And I remember these guys practicing, rehearsing in the basement of the building I was in. And,
Wow.
and of course, I didn't know at the time they were going to be a famous rock band. They were just some guys that were in the architecture department. I was in the sociology department, and these guys were in the architecture department. And it was only years later that it dawned on me that these guys were they used to. They said they related this to historians since that they actually rehearsed in the basements in this college.
Did you ever bump into those guys? Did you
I
know
guess I
any?
must have done, but I mean, they were just, guys hanging around. I mean,
Sure.
college full of people of similar age. You didn't take that much notice, but I remember there was some music going on. And then when I became involved in as a musician in the later 60s, uh, they became very a familiar face on the landscape even before they became as famous as they did. And it was the era, as I say, of people, let's say, writing fantastical lyrics and sort of spacey kind of lyrics and psychedelic, what became called psychedelic lyrics, inspired either by drugs or by associated sort of literature and the kind of imaginative uh, uh, imaginative kind of subject matters, which were most of the bands that came out of that mid 60s scene in England were rhythm and blues bands. So they were R&B bands uh, playing basic blues or derivations of basic blues, bands like the Stones and then later bands like Cream and so on. Whereas the Floyd from the start had gone a step aside from that. They were blues musicians in their basic music because most were at the time. They weren't schooled musicians, uh, and um, and Sid significantly was the only one that didn't come from this particular college they were at, but he was an art student, as were a lot of uh, our rock heroes in the 60s in England. Art school was a particular environment for people like John Lennon, Pete Townsend, Dave Davis. There was a whole kind of cultural melting pot because you know you didn't have to be as articulate as a student of literature or something. Uh, so it lends itself to the kind of guys who had very open minds to things. And Sid Barrett obviously was one of those kind of characters. And so he was in the first period, he was the most imaginative of the band in terms of lyrics and so on.
Yeah, he brought that originality to the Pink Floyd sound. You write, quote, from the start, Sid's compositions featured distinctive, often whimsical lyrics influenced by a variety of sources. And you also talk about he had an edge to his songwriting. What formed that approach? What bands was he a fan on? He read Lord of the Rings,
That's right, yeah.
right? Yeah. What were the bands that he was a fan of? Was he more of an underground guy? He wasn't into
Yeah,
the.
well, that's it. It became very quickly that there was a sort of division in that rhythm and blues scene. There was a sudden division between the mainstream rhythm and blues, if you like, and the kind of underground scene that developed simultaneously. Clubs like UFO in London was the main one. So there was where there was a lot more experimentation going on. Uh, in a way, I mean, I suppose Cream were almost a parallel because they were all the three of Cream were solidly in that rhythm and blues scene. Jack Bruce and Clapton and Ginger Baker, but the Cream environment allowed them to expand instrumentally, certainly into a lot more experimentation. And they started writing songs with Pete Brown, the poet, who got away from the usual blues kind of 12 bar blues sequence of lyrics and so on. And I think that that expansive sort of attitude and experimental attitude, that's what became dubbed the underground in clubs like UFO they and that went along with things like the light shows developed at the same time, which was a visual manifestation on stage. And so the whole stage show, I mean, the Who, for instance, were pioneers of uh, broadening the scope of stage shows, the way they presented their music, and the kind of pyrotechnics involved in the music, the actual dynamics of light and shade, and the use of volume and the use of distortion. And so that whole so-called underground scene musically was a product of these various changes that were occurring and coming together with certain key bands, as I say, and Pink Floyd was at the forefront of that. I mean, their contemporaries were people like Soft Machine and who were much, if you like, much more influenced by jazz than Pink Floyd. So they're all parts of that Melting Pot.
Had you been to that club, the UFO?
Yeah, yeah, played there once.
Oh, wow. Are the stories true that they would hand out acid at shows? What was the Pink
I
Floyd?
guess so. I mean, a lot of it was just stories on in the rock press. You
Yeah,
never,
yeah.
unless you were there at the time, you didn't know. But I mean, my experience of playing there, only played there once, um, was we were all sitting backstage drinking beer.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is like it was then. It was a very mixed kind of scene. So you know, your indulgence might be alcohol, it might be drugs, it might be smoking pot or whatever. But there was no strict division. So you just kind of took it for granted what happened.
What became of the club? Is it still there? Is it?
Oh no, no, no. It's a bit, no. It came and went within a matter of a couple of years.
Oh, geez, I didn't know. Wow.
67, 67, 68.
It's got a legendary status among fans of Pink Floyd in that era because it's always part of some story.
Yeah,
With Barrett as their main songwriter, they did have two hit singles, Arnold Lane, See Emily Play, and then the successful debut studio album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. That was all that from 1967. And this was not something that Sid embraced. There's a highlighted quote in your book where Sid said, if John Lennon doesn't have to do Top of the Pops, why should I? His mental decline was pretty rapid. Was it due to drugs? Was it mental illness? Was it simply an artist who rebelled against commercialism? Was it all of that combined? What do you think?
I think it's probably all of that combined. I mean, the drugs obviously didn't help, and physically they were the main influence on his mental state. The main detrimental influence on his mental state. He wasn't the first and he wasn't the last, but to have that kind of mental history. But he there's a there was a awful, fatal, almost fatal combination of sudden fame and overindulgence. I mean, it happened to a number of rock stars, but with Sid, it was just more disastrous than with many, and it was a combination of fame and. I mean, without the fame, you probably couldn't have afforded so many drugs.
Sure.
If you like to look at it that way. And also, of course, the whole scene was full of hangers-on who made all that very easy. It was very accessible, and it's like it's been like that forever. On the kind of music scene. Uh, but fame is particularly on somebody who's quite young and still feeling their own way in the world. I mean, these were just students. I mean, they were like, 18, 19-year old. They were kids, comparatively speaking. And so if you couldn't quite handle that, and it happened to, not just Sid Barrett, but, if you couldn't handle that quite, uh, you could spiral out of in the wrong direction, which unfortunately he did.
David Gilmour's entrance into the band was somewhat transitional. He was brought in while Sid was still in the band.
That's right.
Now, he knew Sid Barrett already,
Yeah,
David.
yeah, yeah.
They were friends. They knew each other from the music scene.
Yeah, and from the art school scene, I think. But because Gilmore wasn't at the same college as the other three, but he was already got a little name for himself as a session player around the music scene, so he already had his foot in the door, as it were.
Do you think the guys in the band planned on him being a permanent member, David? Was that part of the plan to transition him in?
No, I think the plan was just as a kind of not a replacement for Sid, but of his somebody to deputise for him while he was being, if you like, unreliable. The hope was obviously that he would sort himself out.
Okay. Yeah, the hope was he would get better, but
There was a point where D- Dave Gilmore was in the band, and Sid would still be on stage, but his contribution was becoming less and less reliable, and to the point where they'd switch his amp off because he was playing nonsense. Um, and Gilmore already been started being a kind of reliable session player on the studio scene. He was just a reliable voice to have there, often filling in on what Sid had done on the original records. Just
Yeah, there's a story. What's the talk show that they were on when Sid would, as soon as the cameras were on and they would ask Sid a question, he would go completely quiet and say nothing. And then they'd say, cut, hold on. And then they say, Sid, you just got to answer the questions a little bit. And Sid was playing with him. He's like, oh, no, no problem. No problem. I'll talk. Okay, let's do this again. And then they turn the camera on and he would do the same thing, shut down, not say
yeah,
anything.
yeah. It's just like it was just it became it became totally unreliable, especially if you're trying to handle that.
There's been stories about years later where people would knock on his door because they found out where he lived, and he would open the door sometimes and be friendly and sometimes would say, please leave me alone. Stories that he there was checks that would arrive and that he would never cash, publishing checks, like he wanted nothing to do with the Pink Floyd past. What do you
That's
know
right.
about that? Yeah, you've heard those stories.
I've heard some.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
but he was very reclusive. Pictures of him around town going to the art shop on his bicycle
yeah.
privately. Very sad because then people got intrusive. Pictures of him taking his trash out. It's very, they try to glamorize it almost like it was this fascinating story that there was, people couldn't refuse to really invest themselves into. But like Roger Waters said, it's a sad story. It's a tragic story.
There was that situation where he appeared at some recording session,
Wish you were here. Yeah.
and they didn't recognize him at first when he came in the studio. I mean, he was like such a. It reminds one of Jeremy Spencer, who's a Fleetwood Mac. He went off at a tangent and joined the Children of God, or one of those quasi hippie religious groups in Los Angeles, and disappeared. They never saw him again for months. I mean, he just disappeared off the music scene altogether.
That's a tough position to be in if you are an artist and you do want people to enjoy your art, but you are not in any way interested in being famous. You like a certain amount of attention, respecting your art. People come up to you and say, "I really love what you did," and, "Oh, that's great, thank you." But then complete strangers coming up to you and feeling as if they know you, and at that point, like you said, he's only 18 or 19. He doesn't really know himself yet.
No, exactly.
That's it's a difficult position to be in, and some have been able to transition out of that. Now, he did do solo work, Sid, and David produced it. He did two solo albums. His last one was the self-titled, or just called Barrett, in 1970, and that was it. And then the friction between David Gilmour and Roger Waters. I mean, I guess that started right away. Reading your book, there were signs of that way back on. There's a quote from David of his early rehearsal sessions. And in the book, he says, quote, I actually walked out of one of the first rehearsals. Roger had got so unbearably awful in a way that I'd later get used to that I stomped out of the room. They had such a great chemistry together musically, but what do you think was at the root of their battles? Ego, creative control?
I think it was ego. I mean, I think Roger, um, having formed the band, the very very earliest version of the band, or pre the band, which didn't involve Sid, and then suddenly Sid appeared with this kind of great contribution, but in a way it was a Sid band when it first started making records, and I think Roger suddenly, the kind of control he had over the very very original concept when they were still in the college basement, um, that kind of control slipped away because Sid was the more immediate creative force that took over, and I think subconsciously, if not consciously, Waters probably resented that a bit, or at least missed the fact that it was his band, and and when Sid, through his own problems, wasn't in the picture anymore, I think Roger felt it was his natural inheritance to take over, and with Dave Gilmour being equally dynamic in the whole process, that became a bit of a challenge. So I think Roger Waters definitely had a problem, even though it wasn't self-consciously a problem, uh, a problem with that kind of challenge to say his authority is a bit of a too strong a word, but certainly of his place in the whole creative process, you know.
And by the end, it seemed as if he did have complete creative control by the time you get to the final cut.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
He
Yeah.
wore the guys down. The classic Pink Floyd sound, though, that period when Roger and David and Nick and Richard are all really working together to put together that classic sound that we hear on Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall. That took some time. I mean, that wasn't like it just came out right away. There was a soundtrack album in 1969, more. Umaguma came out in 69 as well. Adam Hart Mother in 1970. David is quoted in the book when talking about Adam Hart Mother. He says, it's shit. The lowest point artistically, he adds.
That's right. Yeah.
Talk about those albums. What do you think about that period as we lead up to metal, around that point when things start to shift with the sound and get popular?
Well, I think there was that period when they were showing various aspects of both what had been and what was to come. Um, I always felt that Adam Hart Mother, it was one of the defining albums of the whole idea of the concept album. I mean, if only because of the first side, which was just a sequence of, it was one, it was, logged as one number with various parts in it, if you remember. And that just even that concept was like uh, quite radical. And it, this is what progressive rock was supposed to be about. It was a kind of, if you like, for want of a better word, a thinking man's rock. It was quite sophisticated and having things uh, in movements, if you like classical music might be. It was in those movements on the first on side one, uh, in a way that kind of typified uh, the seriousness, for want of a better word, of the progressive rock that they took to composition and so on.
And they were all under the label Harvest up until Dark Side of the Moon.
Yeah, yeah.
So did Harvest support that kind of creative ambition and
Yeah, because
experimentation?
Harvest started off as a kind of progressive label. I mean, it started off as EMI's attempt or success to absorb this new progressive music on a separate label. It wasn't a rhythm and blues label. It wasn't a pop label. It was a progressive label.
Okay. Yeah. They belong to the Capitol Music Group, originally created by EMI. Okay. Is it with 1971's Metal where we start to hear the band gel, particularly the song Echoes is one that we could point to as the moment when Pink Floyd makes that shift?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, the thing was with metal, that was highly experimental because they didn't prepare anything beforehand, and they went in and each kind of played a contribution which didn't always work. But it was this very idea of this kind of improvisation for its own sake, if you like.
One of These Days is another song you could point to, the darker side of Pink Floyd, where things start to go. Obscured by Clouds was released in 1972. Interesting country feel to most of that album. And Free For was the single, which I remember here in the States. Classic rock radio played it from time to time, but it sets up the album Dark Side of the Moon, which I've said many times. I think it's the greatest album ever. Just musically, it's beautifully put together, of course. The music's gorgeous and it's brilliant, but the lyrics are, they connect with everybody at no matter what age you are. And as you get older, you will connect with parts of it even more so. You write, quote, the genesis of Pink Floyd's next album and their first non-soundtrack album since Metal in 1971 flew in the face of rock music convention.
When you first heard them, songs like Money and so on, they were so spectacularly memorable just in their own right. Just there was nothing before or after that was quite the same. It was a bit like a new Beatles album. There was nothing it wasn't even comparable to the Beatles' previous album. It's a bit like that. So it kind of had it had a kind of uniqueness of its own, like almost as if it was done by a different band.
Right. The time signature and money.
Exactly. And yeah, and the whole sound of it.
Yeah. And lyrically, the whole concept, Roger, I think, had that in mind at some point coming in, that he wanted to put something together about the human condition, the fears that we have, the insecurities that we have, the desires for things like money.
Well, yes, and he referenced in his own way the mental problems that Sid had.
Yes.
You know, he actually obliquely mentioned and referred to all that.
Yeah, this is the first album where we start to get the influence of Sid Barrett's experience start to enter into the lyrics of the music.
That's right. And in a way, it was Roger's own, even though he wouldn't admit it at the time, his own insecurities, if you like, or uh, came out in that way. That he was aware of his own frailty, or maybe all our frailties, in the sort of context of this bubble that they were now in.
I can't imagine anybody predicting what would become of the album in terms of the long term success, the long term chart success of this album. You know, it stayed on the charts. What was it, on the album charts for however many years? I don't know. It's insane, the record that it set. When you first heard it, what was your response? Did you think, wow, I'm listening to something really special here?
It certainly sounded special. It sounded, I mean, there was so much going on in the early 70s that you didn't immediately assume this was more special than various other things that were happening, but it was certainly the actual sound. Its own sound was unique. It was, and it was certainly the most special thing that they'd done.
Okay. Do you believe any of the Wizard of Oz story?
I don't, do I know this story? I don't know.
Oh my God. So if you play, and you could go to YouTube and you'll see this online and you can watch for yourself, watch and listen. But if you start Dark Side of the Moon at the third roar of the MGM Lion, there's all of these similarities.
Right,
So like when Dorothy's standing on the she's standing on the fence and you hear the lyric balanced on the biggest wave, or as soon as you go into the song Time, you hear the cash register sounds
oh
and all
yeah, yeah,
that.
yeah.
It's exactly when Dorothy opens the door and everything turns to color. Who knows which is which, and you see the two witches. I mean, there's all these things,
Right, right.
and all of the band members have just said there's nothing, we had no idea behind it. But I always say that they didn't do that intentionally, which makes it even more fascinating to me, is that the fact that you can have these synchronicities, these coincidences without even trying, then you start to wonder if there's something if something bigger out there that's pulling the strings. You could check it out on YouTube. Back in the day, I had to go to eBay and somebody put it on a VHS and I watched it. It's pretty fascinating.
Oh, check it out.
Yeah. Pink Floyd Behind the Music is the book. We're talking with author Mike Evans. While the band was personally very enthusiastic about what they had created, they were apprehensive as to the reaction from critics and fans regarding Dark Side of the Moon. We know the overwhelming response, but why do you think it still connects today with such a huge audience?
The songs, for all their complexity, were very accessible. Uh, they don't they didn't they weren't trapped into one genre. They'd gone past just being progressive rock. Uh, this is clever. This is whatever. They were very accessible songs. You can actually hum them in your head, which is always a kind of that was the old formula for a good pop tune. But you could actually hear them in your head, and they're accessible in that way. And as I say, and production wise and everything, they were so strong. They've stood the test of time.
The album cover done by Storm Thorgerson, Aubrey Pollen, Hypnosis, and I believe they did 12 of the 15 studio album covers for Pink Floyd, most notably Dark Side of the Moon. Wish You Were Here, another one with the two businessmen on fire. And I would also put the Iron Beds on the Beach for Momentary Lapse of Reason up there as well. Another classic cover and some great stories behind that. I think the first day of shooting, it was a storm. So they literally had to take all of the iron beds off the beach,
That's
put
right.
them
Yeah.
back on again the next day. I mean, it wasn't like photo trickery. If Storm Thorgerson came out today during the streaming era where album covers are just not as significant as they once were, would people even know about him?
Well, exactly. I mean, it was an era when uh, album covers were almost as memorable as the music, the music inside. Um, I mean, they were of their time where the whole concept, or if you like, the whole um, piece of work, the music therein and the album cover were one and the same. I mean, we're all familiar with the Beatles and the Stones and their album covers that held that kind of significance. But Storm Thorgerson, technically, the interesting thing is that as computerized technology became more and more apparent or more usable, and what you now is out of date anyway, things like Photoshop and that. He never used any of that. He refused to use that. He actually made the things on the cover happen. I mean, by ways and means, a bit like in movies. You had special effects before you had computer generated effects, before CGI.
Those two guys are actual people. Those the two guys on Wish You Were Here
Yes,
are
yes,
two
exactly,
stuntmen.
exactly.
And I think maybe one of the guys said, even though they put something on them to protect them from getting burns, I think they did get a little bit of a burn. There's all these crazy stories about.
It did it like a filmmaker would in those at that time. You got a stuntman. You didn't do it by CGI, um, and he was of that school, if you like.
Let's talk a little bit more about Wish You Were Here from 1975. You write, quote, Roger Waters made it clear very early on in the process that Shine on You Crazy Diamond, which would be the key composition on the new album, was closely related to his affectionate reflections on the band's old comrade, Sid Barrett. You did talk about it a little bit before about what happened with Sid. He showed up out of the blue one day, right? Now, Nick Mason wrote about it in his book, and he puts a picture in the book too of the day that Sid was there. So he just showed up.
It was 7 years after he left the band.
7 years, and they're literally recording a song about him, and he walks in, correct?
Yeah. Nobody knows whether it was coincidence that he the happened upon the moment they were doing that particular song, or whether he just wandered in the studio and that was coincidence, or whether it's a bit of a myth and he wandered in, but that was one of the songs that they were doing. It could have been uh, the myth could have been slightly manipulated, so he didn't actually walk in when they were in the middle of Crazy Diamond. But who knows? But it was certainly remarkable that he appeared at all. That's the point.
They tried talking to him, right? But it really wasn't getting far. He wasn't really connected to reality at that point.
No, I mean, I can't remember now whether Nick Mason ever mentioned how he got in there in the first place. I mean, he didn't just wander in the door.
Somebody had to let him in.
Yeah, yeah,
And there's a story that he had a toothbrush in his hand. He's brushing his teeth while he's
that's
watching him
right. Yeah,
perform. He was overweight. He had shaved his head, and he looked unrecognizable.
yeah.
It's a very eerie story. And again, the fact that they're recording that song, or how much of truth there is to that, but still the
It
fact
was
that he's
certainly, it was,
there.
yeah, exactly. That song came out of that session, put it
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And his condition just left a lasting impression on the band to this day, all the surviving members. And the 1977's Animals is among my top three Pink Floyd albums, not an album that would have any FM rock friendly songs on it. There are three songs clocking in at 17 minutes, 11 minutes, and 10 minutes long. That's Dogs, Pigs, and Sheep. And then their book ended by two short 1 minute 24-second songs titled Pigs on the Wing, parts one and two. Roger's concept was inspired by George Orwell's Animal Farm. It's a scathing critique of ruthless businessmen, corrupt leaders, and the exploited masses. Rick Wright is quoted in the book talking about how Roger wouldn't let Rick contribute any songwriting. Is this where Roger tries to take over the band, or is really starting to take over the band?
I think it was, yeah. He There was so much tension, particularly between Roger and Rick Wright at the time. Um, and I mean, Roger's concept was, as you say, it encompassed his growing critique of both the rock business and the politics that surrounded it. I mean, the political free market kind of politics that was rampant in the UK at the time, or just emerging in the UK, that became the kind of entrepreneurship in the 80s, which many saw as being creatively destructive. And it was it was Roger Waters', if you like, reaction to that, but also to the to the again, their own position. I mean, he was very frustrated by the fact that it was a bit like Sid in it, a mirror image of Sid, that it was the fame and the glory didn't sit comfortably with somebody who was that critical about the rock business. You couldn't have it both ways. That you were having enjoying the it's a bit like the Beatles. You were enjoying the artistic freedom that success created, but then again, the success, from one point of view, limited your artistic freedom, because you felt like your next album had to be as big a seller as the last one. So there was artistic pressure which was cre impinging on your creative freedom, but that success had allowed you that creative freedom, and certainly that technical freedom too.
And Roger was also now, as a result of the fame, he's starting to feel alienated by the fans during this period too. There's a spitting incident. Talk about
That's
that.
right.
The spitting incident, and how did Roger's childhood also inspire 1979's The Wall?
Well, again, the Wall was his whole wonderful album, and oh, that's my cat. In many ways, did you hear that?
No, I didn't hear. The cat can
Um,
come in if you'd like.
hey,
The cat can come in and be part of it.
yeah, let's see what it was.
Here we go.
Come on,
Hey, I saw the tail.
yeah, come on, um, come on,
All right,
come
who do
on,
we got?
come on.
What's the cat's name? Boy, girl? That's a beauty.
His name's Twinkle.
Twinkle. Hey, Twinkle.
Who's that?
Ah, he's a beautiful cat. I love it. I'm a cat
Um,
fan.
yeah, and
So yeah, there's a spitting incident, and then Roger's childhood. Those two things together really seem to inspire The Wall.
that's right. And this whole thing, that the whole image of the the tyrannical school teachers, and the pressures on kids when they were, not quite teenagers yet, and that whole thing. It was it was certainly as iconic an album as Dark Side of the Moon, in a different way. I remember my kids. My son was a huge fan of The Wall, and he would have been, where were we? 79. He would have been, oh, I don't know, in his early teens, you know. And like it hit home. It hit home, and when they brought that single out with the kids chorus on it,
So, we don't need no education.
we don't need no education. That was a wonderful anthem for kids his age.
Same here. I was 7, 8 years old, and there were kids in school that would sing that.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
And so it was a great. It was a great album, and it came out of Roger Waters' own, if you like, frustrated youth and whatever.
Yeah.
Great stuff though.
1983 is the final cut, the last Pink Floyd album to feature Roger Waters, the only without Rick Wright, who left the band under pressure from Roger after the Wall sessions. You lead the chapter with a quote from Nick Mason. Nick said, "It may be that in Roger's head, he was already moving into a solo career and merely wanted David and me to assist him in his aspirations." How much truth is there to Nick's quote?
I think there's a lot of truth in that. Yeah, that I think Roger got to the stage where it was the albums were his albums, the band was his band, and the three other players were, as he says, assistants in achieving that result. You know,
Not Now John is my only personal highlight from the album. I'm not a huge fan of the album. What is your opinion of the final cut?
I think it's a bit messy. You know, there was a lot of there was that there was material on it that was intended for the wall, and so that made some of it made it a bit messy anyway. I think, and it was in many ways it didn't stand up against uh, most of the other albums in that way.
Yeah, the Fletcher Memorial Home is another good one, I should say. But it's
Yeah.
not. Yeah, it sounds like a band on its way out. Like
Yes.
there's clearly something wrong here. You write, quote, following the release of the final cut, Pink Floyd as a unit was in complete disarray. There was about a 4 year gap between the final cut and the next album, 1987's Momentary Lapse of Reason. This is with Gilmore, Mason, and Wright. I believe Rick Wright was under a contract deal. He wasn't officially a member of the band, but really
That's
he's
right.
he's there. He's part of the recording process. Gilmore and Mason never intended to end Pink Floyd, but Roger tried to stop that. How does that war in the High Court ultimately come to an end? What, because I think this has to do with ultimately years later, Roger being able to tour off of the wall. I think, right? Didn't they say that can be your thing?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
There are a lot of kind of copyright issues and uh, these legal battles, which is, it's not the first band it happened to, it's not the last band it happened to, but the legal battles over copyright and uh, who's responsible for certain work, gets very messy when it ends up in the courts. I mean, when you write a song and you're not a professional songwriter, but you're a musician and you're writing a song with a bunch of other musicians, it's very hard to find that dividing line between who wrote this, who wrote that. Okay, you could say he wrote that lyric, but certainly the music and as it appears on the record is everybody's in the sense that they all contributed, but it's they don't come out as songwriters.
Right. But also keep in mind, it wasn't Roger's band to begin with. It was Sid's
No,
band.
exactly. I mean, Lennon and McCartney made twice as much more, twice, 10 times as much money as the other Beatles, but purely because they wrote all the songs. But the contribution of the other members in the recorded tracks was 25%, of the four Beatles, you
Yeah.
could say.
Yeah. Roger's an interesting guy. I'm a fan of his, but it's hard to be a fan sometimes with the things he'll say. He made those comments about Ozzy Osbourne when he passed away. Just, it's terrible things to say about a guy who just died. You might as well just say, I'm sorry to hear he passed away, but instead, he's taking shots at Ozzy and he was a weird guy. And yeah, that's Roger. He's always been that way. He always seemed like a super serious guy.
Yeah.
I don't know if he's combative by nature, but you can see I kind of feel for David Gilmour. I can imagine what he and those guys, were up against, especially as they became a huge success. They had to keep that machine going, and
Yeah.
it wasn't easy to get along with them.
I mean, put it this way, he was probably like a lot of highly creative people. He's probably a nightmare to work with.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
it's not unusual that you get very creative people who if it's difficult for them to be in a cooperative kind of environment work-wise. They've got to be dominant or they by nature of their contribution they become dominant,
yeah.
and it's difficult for the others sometimes uh Do you feel comfortable with that?
The story of Bob Ezrin, who produced The Wall, when Bob Ezrin showed up like 5 minutes late for a recording session, and Roger's standing there waiting for him outside, and he's pointing at his watch like, "You're 5 minutes late." And Ezrin blew up on him. He said, "Don't you ever do that to me again." That's Roger. He is who he is, but he's a brilliant musician, and
Yeah.
you can't argue that. Momentary Lapse of Reason, a huge commercial success, top 5 album, Learning to Fly, #1 single on mainstream rock radio. The ensuing tour, a massive success. And they pulled it off again with '94's A Division Bell, #1 in 10 countries. Here's my question to you. I'm a child of the '80s. I love the post Roger era Pink Floyd. Do you have to be of a certain age to feel that way? Is it those who grew up during the Roger Waters era? Is it impossible for them to embrace what came after?
It's certainly not impossible to embrace it. Obviously, I think the fans that grew up, if you like, into an earlier era of the Floyd, of there's a stronger pull. Of the comparison is
There's an emotional attachment too, if you're of a certain
yes,
age.
exactly, yeah, yeah. I
There's
mean,
a certain age
yeah,
period where you connect with music. So
yeah. I mean, if you
that's why
grew
I
up with
asked
the
that.
Dark Side of the Moon, it'd be very hard to find anything else that was as in your own mind as it have as much impact.
Sure. What do you think of those two albums, Momentary Lapse and Division Bell? Are you a fan of them?
Yeah, but they're not my favorite Floyd albums by any means. No.
I think that's the response
Yeah,
that's common, you know, of a certain age group. If you
yeah.
grew up and you made that attachment to, so and some will even say the Sid era is really the best era, but
No,
most,
exactly.
you know, but most will say, yeah, without Roger, forget it. But again, that's, you know, I'm born in 1972. I'm coming up at a time that we're watching MTV and I'm seeing Learning to Fly and I'm hearing it on the radio and I'm hearing all the singles on radio. And I just fell in love with it. I love the sound of David's voice. I love the sound of his guitar playing. I love the whole concept of the Pink Floyd sound that they were able to put together, which is interesting too, because Momentary Lapse of Reason, the story is David put together some songs at first that just didn't sound Pink Floyd enough for the record label. And they said, you got to go back to the drawing board on this. And they did, because they said it doesn't sound Pink Floydish enough, which I find that very interesting. It's like all of a sudden now David Gilmour's finding himself in this position where he's created he's part of a creation of this monster that he has to now continue. When Roger rejoined Pink Floyd in 2005 for Live 8, I got the goosebumps when I saw. What was your response? Was there a part of you that thought maybe we'll get something more than just this? Maybe we'll get some recorded music. What was going through your mind when you saw this?
I think I'm not trying to be clever or sound clever, but I think I assumed it was a one-off, or is it was it
You
wasn't
knew
gonna
enough, yeah.
it wasn't gonna yeah.
Because the stories are they didn't get along even that day.
Yeah,
Although there's a
exactly.
picture in your book where they're hugging. I was like,
That's
wow,
right.
they're
Yeah.
hugging.
It was a
But
nice one-off,
right.
but it wasn't gonna materialize.
I think Roger seemed to be excited more so than the others. I think Roger was a little bit more excited.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, yeah, because suddenly he's back in the fold.
Right. Of course, if that were going to be allowed, then he's probably thinking, I'll be back in the fold and back in charge,
Yeah,
and David's
exactly,
like,
exactly.
no.
No, 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 exactly. It was a nice event, and it was a nice little period. But you didn't want to go back to those nightmares.
Oh, yeah. I wondered too. Sid Barrett at that time was still alive. He would pass a year later, but I was thinking, man, is he watching? Just all
Yeah,
those things as a Pink Floyd fan going through my mind. But yeah, sadly, Sid died in '06. And then Rick Wright passed away 2 years later.
yeah,
The
208, yeah,
Endless 2008. The Endless River came out in 2014, mostly instrumental music that came from the sessions from the Division Bell album. It's a tribute to Rick, a nice tribute and an end to Pink Floyd. And Roger, as we know, has had a resurgence, huge resurgence with his tours. There was a period there where he was playing small arenas and, in the same town or city, Pink Floyd's playing, in a huge stadium. So he's really, he's really come a long way since then as a solo artist and continuing with the Pink Floyd music. David Gilmour put out an excellent solo album a year ago, Luck and Strange.
That's right. Yeah.
There's some, of course, there are great Pink Floyd tributes out there. The Australian Pink Floyd show is one that's great. What should Pink Floyd's legacy be defined by, in your opinion, from this point forward? What is the legacy of Pink Floyd?
I think the legacy as, if you like, the epitome of what used to be called progressive rock, rock that had a vision, a technical vision, and a lyrical vision uh, over a good span of time. They weren't around for 8 years like the Beatles. They were around. I think they epitomized progressive rock as it was called in back in the day, and the technical expertise really opened up the possibilities of what you could do within the context of rock music. I mean, I'm a great jazz fan, but the great thing about jazz is that you didn't. There were there were there were technical changes in the studio, obviously, from the very earliest days to now, but they didn't exploit the technical changes in the way that rock musicians did, really. It was more about the musicians, how good they were on the, and still is, how good they are on their instruments, which is wonderful in itself. It's a different art form, totally different art form. Um, but um, but Floyd did epitomize what the best of that progressive period that went far beyond just just the 1970s, which is when the phrase was coined.
Pink Floyd Behind the Music. The book is out now. It's been out. I think it came out in the summer, June or July.
Yeah, beginning of July. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's available wherever books are sold, and you can find it at your nearest bookstore. Look for it at your nearest independent bookstore. You can find your nearest independent bookstore at bookedonrock.com. I'm glad that we were able to talk to you about this book, and I would love to have you back on again. You got any books that you're planning for, and any in the future that you're going to be
Yeah,
putting?
yeah. I mean, I've got my latest book, which won't be out until I guess next spring, which I've just finished, which is a history of the blues, which has been done time and time again. But it's called the history of the story of the blues in 50 songs.
Oh,
So it's
great.
just 50 blues numbers, but going from the very first blues records to very contemporary stuff now. Um, and blues in a fairly broad sense of the word, there's rock and roll, rhythm and blues, big bands, um, Bob Dylan, and various people who play blues but they're not all necessarily what we call blues musicians.
Is John Lee Hooker in there? That's my favorite.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
Hooker,
he's my
yeah.
personal favorite.
I actually jammed with Hooker once
Did you really?
in the Cavern in Liverpool, yeah,
Back in the day, huh?
because I play sax.
Okay. I'm very fortunate to have had his son on, John Lee Hooker Jr., who
Oh yeah,
played with his dad for a while there and went through some personal struggles and just came out of it. And he's just a wonderful man. I mean, I mean that sincere. I mean, he's just such a nice guy. And I was telling him, I said, your dad, man, he's my favorite, hands down.
yeah, I
So
jammed with Hooker, 60, 65. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to that book, and I would love to have you on to talk about it and get the word out about it. You have an open invite, Mike. Thank you for coming on
Thank
to
you.
talk about this Pink Floyd book. Great job.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.